Good evening, everyone. Tonight we are holding our second and final scheduled meeting pertaining to the DEP proposed remedial response action to address contamination associated with the BT Bishop Tube hazardous site. I'm joined up here on the podium. On my right is Rich Orlow, and on my left, Peter Fitzler. Also in attendance here in the building are Tony Finding and Nicholas Santella from BSTI, who will be leading much of the discussion tonight. And Steve Brown is manning the computer here in the absence of Donna, who is virtual. So any complaints can be directed to Steve Brown. Steve Hahn is also remote, our solicitor. And again, Donna Weichert is handling operations via Zoom, and any questions will be handled through her from the public. We have one person in attendance at tonight's meeting, Deb Mobile. Thank you for showing up, Deb. Good to see you. The purpose of tonight's meeting is for BSTI to present draft comments responding to the analysis of alternatives and proposed responses by the DEP. The board will consider the comments and questions made this evening and will then finalize its official comments in the days ahead. We will submit those comments to the DEP no later than the cutoff date mandated by DEP of January 31st. My final comment that I wanted to pass along is that the comments the township, will provide to the DEP no later than January 31st. But I just want to point out that this does not preclude the residents from contacting DEP on a direct basis for any of their comments as well. I think that's an important point. So at this point in time, I guess I'll turn it over to Steve and Tony and Nicholas to run through the PowerPoint that they have. Unless, Rich, do you have any other questions or comments?
No, I'm fine.
Peter?
I'm good. I'm ready for the presentation.
Okay.
All right, so move that up. So hopefully everybody can hear me with the mask. Following up on the previous meetings that we had and taking some of the public comments that we received during those meetings into account, we're going to present the draft comments that may come from the township with respect to the Bishop Tube site.
Excuse me, who is speaking?
This is Nicholas Santella with BSTI, one of the consultants, a hydrogeologist and chemist who reviewed the PADP administrative record and is assisting the township in drafting the comments. So the purpose of presenting these comments in their draft form is to get public input. So we are, going to put forth an outline essentially of what the comments are going to look like, can answer any questions about technical details, and we'll welcome anything that anyone has to offer as additional topics for potential comment. I guess next slide if you can. So I just wanted to start with a review of what PADP's proposed response was. This is a very small and hard to read matrix that provides a lot of detail, but in broad outline, PADP is proposing in situ treatment for both soil and groundwater. For soil, there will be a soil mixing process to mechanically ensure that the chemicals, and those chemicals have not yet been determined, that are added to the soil to react with the contaminants that are present, are evenly distributed and have an opportunity to interact with the COCs completely. And there will be a groundwater remedy also using its in situ injections of chemicals which have not been precisely determined, nor have the locations or precise depths of these injections been determined. But the costs are associated with the addendum to the feasibility study that was presented for the site, and it basically consists of a limited treatment of the two significant CVOC source areas, with a primary focus on injections in the, in the top of bedrock, and the potential for additional injections into shallow bedrock if necessary. There are a lot of unknowns that still need to be determined to precisely define the nature of that remediation, but there are a number of additional things that will be required in the form of institutional and engineering controls to eliminate risk at the site, as well as off-site potentially, after that remediation takes place, because there is not an expectation, particularly with respect to groundwater, that there will be 100% removal of the contaminants that are present. And I guess I'll just add that the cost of the soil remediation was estimated at around $2.8 million, and for groundwater about 5.2, and that's half active remediation costs and half ongoing monitoring that will be required to understand the success of the remediation, and implement some of the other measures like best management practice controls of stormwater infiltration that will be part of the overall remediation. Yeah, I think that's it for this slide.
Nicholas, question for you. And this is Scott Lambert. I'm I guess we will probably interject every now and then with questions.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Just so you're not thrown off here. One of the questions that I have, and it'll be probably consistent throughout your description, is just what impact, and I know it's a question that's really subjective, but what type of impact would there be with further delays of not running through this remediation in terms of the soil contamination and everything that's surrounded to it? And maybe in another form of a question, it would be like waiting 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. Is it a minor? Would it be a medium? Would it be catastrophic in nature if we waited for this process to begin and to remediate these issues?
Yeah, I'll try to answer that, and I'll let maybe Tony give a second answer, but I would say that's a difficult question to answer, because on the one hand, you could argue that it is minor, that the current risks at the site have been assessed, and a reasonable, at least, argument has been made that there are not present unacceptable risks. If site use does not change, if no one, modifies off-site structures in a way to make vapor intrusion conditions worse, if none of those things occur, then, conditions won't get worse. It'll probably be similar to what, the contamination has obviously been there for a very long time already, and conditions will probably be similar in a few years, or maybe even slightly better. On the other hand, any delay simply pushes out by 2, 5, 10 years when conditions may start to improve more rapidly, and a source area remediation will, if successfully implemented, significantly speed up the rate at which concentrations in the Little Valley Creek and in people's basements, essentially speaking of TC vapors, are reduced, which is obviously desirable. So I don't think anyone would describe a delay as catastrophic, but a good argument can be made for the fact that it's not desirable. Tony, do you want to add anything to that?
I think you just nailed it, that it's not desirable due to, vapor intrusion potentials and the continuing issue with the Little Valley Creek.
Okay, thank you, guys.
All right, so, this slide just summarizes kind of the broad outline of the 5 major comments that we are putting forth. I'm just going to outline them to kind of let you know where we're going and then go through each one in additional detail. The first being that the remedial goals have to be coordinated for this remediation with the approved residential site use. That is something that has been explicitly excluded from some of the existing administrative record documents. So risk assessment and assessment of residential endpoints is not really built into all of these remedial plans as they exist. Some of them have considered that as an endpoint, some have not, and they need to be. The second general major point is that PADP should provide additional clarity on exactly what is going to be included in the pre-remedial design investigation required at the site, specifically since some aspects of that are again excluded from the current scope of work, things like delineation of soil to residential standards. The third general comment is that more communication from PADP is required to let the community know how the significant technical and management challenges that are presented by the site are going to be addressed, both by PADP and the remediators. The remediation of fractured bedrock is obviously very challenging, and this site has had some history of remedial activities that have not been fully successful. And so that all needs to be taken into account. Fourth, that there have to be proactive efforts from PADP to ensure the safety of residents and clearly communicate how those efforts will be developed and executed. And again, the specific circumstances of this site make that particularly important because some of these safety issues, things like management of future vapor intrusion, institutional and engineering controls, may not all be in the control of the current responsible party when it comes to implementation. And so there needs to be a broader outline by PADP of exactly what these things consist of. At this stage, kind of everyone presents it as there will be remediation and then there will be institutional and engineering controls to address residual risk. But I think the public needs to know more specifically what some of those may look like. And lastly, that there's a need for timely and rigorous oversight by DAP, and that the township should not be put in position of having to try to manage environmental risk associated with some of those aspects of remediation that are out in the future and not something that's going to happen probably going to happen in the next couple of years. So that's the broad outline of what the comments that are being put forward are. If anyone has any questions from that, if not, I'll just go through each one of those in more specific detail.
Yeah, as a general rule, the logistics of any remediation is this step, DEP is coming up with the acceptable form of remediation, but the actual work will be completed by the responsible parties or DEP?
That can actually go both ways, but generally speaking, the actual work itself will be completed by the responsible parties, unless they refuse to do so and PADP moves forward with it on their own and then attempts to recover those costs.
Again, this is Scott Lambert. Do you have another question, Rich?
No.
I'm sorry. Nick, one of the things that struck me here that I'd like to comment and I'd like to see push down to DEP is that there's going to be many eyes on this process as we go forward. We're going to have residents looking at what's going on. We're going to have local authorities. We're going to have county authorities. And our staff tends to be the focal point to many of these questions as far as what's going on, what is this going on, this looks wrong. I would like to see that as the first line of answering questions most of the time. I'd like DEP to help them out and to help out the residents and anyone else following this process to put together a workflow timeline of the remedial action so that, you know, we can follow up. The question comes in, yes, this project was done. They're moving on to the next step, so we can kind of anticipate that. If there's any issues with security, with people being on the property when they shouldn't be on the property, then our police folks would know that someone is intruding on the property at a wrong time. I think I would like to see that type of spreadsheet. And then along with the completion date of those different layers that they're providing. So we're all in the, everything is being transparent in terms of what's going on, who's doing it, and when it's done. Maybe a little cumbersome, but I think in the long run it'll help everyone out.
No, I can understand how that would be very helpful, and obviously the challenge is right now the outline is very conceptual, you know, that it may take 4 years to do soil, 7 years to do the active part of groundwater, and we'll, you know, need to pin that down a little bit more before they're able to, you know, provide that type of more detailed timeline for the remediation, you know, and I think that is a reasonable expectation from the more detailed remediation plan that's going to need to be forthcoming. I don't know.
And it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to make sure that DEP has a designated representative to answer questions maybe from the residents. I know Dustin is at this point in time the contact person, but I don't know if he's going to be that person going forward. So that would be, I think, helpful as well.
Excellent. If want to move to the next slide. So this is just to elaborate on the first comment that remedial goals have to be coordinated with the expected residential site use. Residential use has been approved by the township, but it's not explicitly addressed in PADP's assessment or remedial approach. It has been acknowledged as the probable goal of the remediation of soils in the assessment that was performed by PADP's consultant, GES. But there has been no specific path identified, again, beyond remediation and then some institutional engineering controls to be determined as to exactly how that would be achieved. And the township has even more stringently required that with respect to development, statewide health standards be applied to remediation in some of the areas of concern. So while that responsibility for remediation may fall to different parties, both the responsible party group and potentially a future developer, PADP is ultimately responsible for the remediation as a whole being protective, and they need to make more clear how that is going to be achieved in the context of the specific remedial action that's going to be undertaken. To that end, we would propose that the most stringent residential standards should be applied throughout the remedial action, both when designing the remedial action, monitoring it, and evaluating what adjustments may be needed over time as the remediation progresses. Any comments or?
No, this is Peter speaking. I would agree with that absolutely. If potentially residential homes were to be built there, there could be no exception to the standard.
Right, and obviously the current situation and somewhat confusing division of responsibility is something that PADP has agreed to, and they just need to manage it to make it clear to everyone how that's all going to be addressed in the end of remediation.
Nicholas, let me ask you this. I don't know if this is needed or not, but would it make sense to make it very clear to DEP that in our preliminary land development approval, we included up to 15 or so conditions related to this residential development going forward? And a substantial amount of those 15 include environmental specific details that need to be met. And do you think it would be appropriate to make sure that DEP knows what those numerous conditions are?
Yes, I would definitely agree that highlighting those in the written comments, and some of those are, as currently drafted, highlighted, the use of statewide health standards in some situations, the aspects of potential future vapor mitigation that have been written into those. Some of those things are highlighted in the current, but some of the additional things like the ATSDR recommendations for for public safety, some of those other things may be worth highlighting in addition. So I think that is a helpful comment.
Excuse me, this is Donna. I just wanted to ask a quick question on how we're going to handle questions from the residents, because I have someone's hand up and I didn't know if you wanted to finish the presentation before questions or how you guys wanted to handle that. I'm sorry.
I'm open to whatever you think will be most appropriate.
I'm okay, maybe at the end of each slide, so that Nicholas can go through the points and then ask the question, Donna.
Okay.
All right, no, that's great. Does that mean that we have some questions?
We do
answer
have
now?
one question from Sarah. So Sarah, could you unmute yourself? There you go.
Hi, everybody.
Sarah, you need to identify, Sarah, first you need to identify yourself and your address.
Sarah Casper, and I work with the community, the Bishop Tube community. My background is working with US EPA Region 3. And having worked on sites in Pennsylvania, it is customary for the townships to work with DEP. You have every right to make whatever statements you want and request, because it's a two-way thing. It's not one way. DEP doesn't say, well, you may speak now, but not then. It should be more like a roundtable discussion. And I think maybe you have needed that all along, because there's been pretty much an absence of communication back and forth. Another issue to me that makes this more critical is that what runs off from the site that is still contaminated goes into Little Valley Creek and God knows where else. And that has not been determined. But in Valley Creek, at Valley Forge Park, they have found PFAS, the perfluorinated compounds known as the forever chemicals. So there is more than likely a source at the site, and that's never been investigated. It also could be associated with some of the health issues that have existed at the site and continue to exist, which makes me think that the site has reached no status. It is still emitting, releasing whatever it has hidden underneath there or above ground. So that's all I wanted to say. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ooh.
I have a quick question about
Sure.
the Stepmobile, for anybody who's recording.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I don't know who's speaking,
Okay.
and we need to.
All right, is this on? Okay. Deb Mobile. I had a question, and I'm not sure whether I got this from our last meeting, but I was under the impression that they had chosen a more, a cheaper method. There were different methods of cleanup, and the method that they chose was kind of like in the middle of the three tiers as far as cost efficiency. But that cost efficiency method is not necessarily conducive to residential zoning. In other words, they're going in and choosing a method that doesn't guarantee residential, and then they're going to go in after the fact and put in like vapor extractors and stuff in each house to try and, like, if in fact it's zone residential, shouldn't they be, I mean, I understand it's more hundreds of millions of dollars, but that's not my issue. My issue is, if it's zoned that way, if you're going to allow houses there, shouldn't you be demanding that the responsible parties pay for the method that ensures that?
So it is correct that and perhaps you're specifically speaking of the soil remediation aspect, that the cost of the in situ methods is somewhat lower than excavation and off-site disposal, which in some cases is preferred for residential development because it is very clear cut. If the soil is no longer there, there is clearly no longer a risk. There are downsides to it as well, sort of associated environmental costs and just high financial costs. But so that part is correct. That is not to say that an in situ method is not appropriate. It can be entirely appropriate for residential use as well if you can meet the standards that are associated with residential use, be those site-specific or statewide standards. If you can have a successful remediation, bring concentrations down, and then control any other additional pathways of exposure, such as vapor, there's no reason it can't be done safely. It just may be a little bit more complicated or take a few more steps.
Okay, thank Donna, do we have any questions as we move
No.
on? Okay.
You can move on.
Rich,
All right,
do you have a
good.
question, I think?
On a next slide. So the other comment, second, I should say, is that PADP needs to provide additional clarity on the pre-design investigations that are required at the site. So some of that additional evaluation, and there's quite a number of topics on which additional evaluation is required. That includes, how to protect Little Valley Creek during remediation, delineation of various compounds. Some of them are quite significant for both the remedial design and the potential outcomes of the remediation. Some of the major ones that we highlight are, again, coming from some of the public comments, the potential presence of per and polyfluorinated substances, which have never been evaluated at the site, but for which there are now PADEP standards for. The delineation of soils to residential standards rather than non-residential standards, and pretty significantly the completion of horizontal and vertical delineation of groundwater impacts, specifically as they pertain to impacts to deep bedrock and the presence potentially of residual DNAPL in the deep bedrock. That is something that may have a significant effect on the persistence of the plume after remediation is complete. And there are potential, at least for other forms of data assessment, things like estimations of mass distribution and mass flux through the groundwater plume with depth that may assist in making a decision about how that deep bedrock may affect the ultimate success of the remediation as measured by some of PADEP's remedial action objectives, which are to retract the plume and to reduce the mass flux from the site. And since those are all significant points, kind of the most important comment on this topic is that PADEP needs to ensure that there's an opportunity for public comment once all those facts and additional information are known and are made public. And right now, there's just not enough information to say kind of what the implications are for the ultimate remediation. Any comments or questions on that?
I do have one. I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask this just for the sake of it. Is that how concerned are you for any type of negative air quality that could result from any of this remediation for residents closest to the site at General Warren area?
I think it's a good question, and it's certainly a possibility. There are no specifics presented about what control measures may be required during remediation, but there is, control measures are possible. You can have vapor capture during the soil mixing process to ensure that there are not emissions. Currently, a lot of the impacts are, at depth, not at the surface, but the purpose of that soil mixing, is to get a good distribution of the chemicals with the COCs, which will kind of tend to bring them up to the surface in the process. PADEP has kind of hinted that those kind of controls may be necessary in their, in their video presentation that went out with the assessment, but there's nothing in the assessment specifically addressing what types of, dust monitoring or vapor monitoring or other safety measures may be required. But it is a reasonable expectation that those would, again, be part of a more detailed, full remedial plan.
In your experience, this is Peter speaking again. In your experience with brownfield sites, I guess my question is, can we be confident that the DEP will be able to identify all the hazardous chemicals in the ground? Is that out of their scope to be able to do, or is it always just going to remain a mystery, because it seems to be the elephant in the room that no one can identify that what's truly wrong with this site is what's in the ground, and no one can say what's in the ground? Are we ever going to get to that, is I guess when you boil my question down?
Yeah, I would say that the state of knowledge has certainly been evolving. There was an initial focus on fluorine essentially, then VOCs in the 80s, and now there's some attention being paid to emerging contaminants at the site. 1,4-dioxane is frequently associated with chlorinated solvents and is present at the site. That was something that was basically just recently measured. PFAS has not been addressed, and it's certainly a possibility, one that we recommend be evaluated, and PADEP has been pushing for at other sites, so it seems like a reasonable request. I'm sure that there are other things that are potentially out there. Being able to control exposure pathways, so groundwater use being one of them, vapor intrusion being another, if you can control the pathways, that, you know, exposure to surface water, you can, to some extent, control exposure to chemicals, even if you don't know exactly what the chemicals are. So, you know, that is another way that, you know, remedial progress sooner is beneficial. You know, it lets you control, to some extent, the things you don't know about yet, as well as the things you do. For example, if there were PFAS in that potable well that's currently being treated with carbon, the carbon may not be fully treating the PFAS, just as an example. Not saying that's the case. Anything else, or I move on to the next slide?
There's two questions. Joan M., can you unmute yourself, please? We can't hear you.
Okay, all right. Thought I had hit it. I didn't hit it hard enough. I guess my
Joan,
question. Oh, sorry.
You're going to need to. You have to identify yourself. Everybody has to identify themselves.
And I'm not sure. Am I allowed to speak since I moved out of the neighborhood and out of the township?
I believe.
Yes,
so.
yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, excuse me.
Yeah.
I
Okay,
don't
so-
know who that was that just jumped in there. Somebody just said yes, yes,
Yeah, it was actually Kathleen Stauffer, and you guys, please don't just jump in, all right? She's trying to record this, so please.
Okay,
It
so
was
it's
Kathleen Stauffer.
Joan Smallwood, formerly of Village Way. We just moved out in July. I think what's concerning me through all of this is that what I keep hearing is that, you know, they have DEP has not identified exactly what's the chemicals that are at the site. They haven't precisely identified how they're going to fix it, and they haven't precisely identified how they intend to protect the residents in the area from the soils that will be lifted up, the vapor contamination, and the water contamination. How can they expect the public to comment on plans that are so vague? And how can they expect the public to buy into, or the township for that matter, to buy into plans that are this vague? I think that the timing is so premature for all of this. I don't see how they can expect anyone to make any kind of reasonable decisions. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Kathleen, can you unmute yourself, please, and identify yourself?
Hi, Kathleen Stauffer, and my husband Larry's here as well. 64 Farmstock Road in the General Warren Village. There's so much that's been said that one of the things too, BSIT, like the fact that as much as we know, we don't know, concerns me greatly, and I appreciate everything that you're putting forth. I'm concerned about the chemicals not yet identified or determined. As many of you know, that we are the parents of a survivor of brain tumors who was a pallbearer at her best friend's funeral, who lived up south of Bishop Tube, upwind of Bishop Tube, and she died of sarcoma at 16 years old. We tried to do a tort suit, and we found out that you can't include dead people in a tort suit, that our neighborhood is known as a cancer hub, that this area is known as a blastoma hub. One of the things, one of the most absurd things for me is we actually sued the township asking a judge to overrule allowing the development to happen, and our brilliant lawyer Mark Freed talked about the DEP does DEP up here, township does township up here. And for me, like, if this township could say, number one ordinance, you cannot build on a toxic site, you could change your ordinances. But the thing that was profound to me during that court hearing is that it was me representing my community with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. Our township supervisor, our township solicitor was on the other table with a developer. And it was glaring to me, so who are you supporting, township solicitor? Who supervisors are you supporting? It's very concerning to me, all the holes that are in the DEPs, and I understand what you're doing now is trying to make up for time. 4 decades, they sat on it. And we sat on it here. We didn't know that we bought a house in a cancer hub. This is very emotional for me, and I apologize for that. I don't apologize for that. This is very emotional. I would like to see the DEP and our township meet and not get this cleaned up as best as it can and turn it to a green and open space and let the earth take care of it.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly a difficult situation.
I don't think there's any more questions. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. So I'll move on to the next general comment, that additional communication from PADP is required to inform the community how challenges to successful remediation will be met. There have been prior efforts at remediation of the site that have been less than successful, both due to technical and management challenges. There are management techniques specifically designed for remediation in challenging circumstances like that. Adaptive site management techniques that are characterized by ongoing assessment and being flexible in your remedial strategy, and some of those concepts may assist in addressing these challenges. And it's I think a good question whether PADP can implement some of those in their management approach, which can sometimes have a long lead time and make it difficult to change direction rapidly. There should be additional clarification from PDP on how some of the challenges like duration of the remediation's effects on groundwater. They're proposing in the FS addendum single injection events that will then be assessed for their effect, but how long will those effects last? Typically, it depends on the loading of the chemicals compared to the amount of contaminants that are present, and if those are out of balance, that the effects can be fairly brief in duration, maybe only a few years, and there hasn't been a kind of a quantitative assessment of mass distribution at this point, at least, so that is an open question. There's the potential for production of toxic daughter products during the breakdown of TC that's proposed by reductive dechlorination, vinyl chloride being the obvious. And that needs to be managed as part of the remedial process. And pretty significantly, how protection of the Little Valley Creek will be addressed. It's been put forth in the assessment that some of these techniques that are proposed for remediation may not be applicable in some of the areas of concern which are closest to Little Valley Creek, but there's a potential for changes in groundwater chemistry, for inadvertent impacts of a variety of sorts to Little Valley Creek during remediation that need to be addressed, and it's only stated essentially that they will need to be addressed, but not specifics of how. Additionally, there should be more clarity from PADP on how they intend to evaluate the question of deep bedrock remediation. The assessment indicates that additional evaluation is required to determine whether that is possible or not. But the costs that are put forth in the assessment are those for remediation solely of shallow bedrock on site. What does that mean? How will they assess whether or not it is technically impracticable to remediate deep bedrock? And if it is impracticable, what will that mean for the configuration of the plume over time? That's something that there have been qualitative arguments from the responsible party group with respect to, but no conclusive quantitative evaluation. Simply what is PADB going to require with respect to that? And lastly on this topic, something that actually came directly also from public comments in the previous meetings, the public deserves some clarity on how PAD expects the remediation to be financed and whether this may impose any limits on the remedial activities. You know, whether this is going to be initiated by the responsible party group, by PADP, you know, how that all is expected to work is obviously not touched at all in the assessment. Any questions from that?
Yeah, Rich Orlo. A lot of our response is going to be we want more information about different aspects of the proposed remediation. Shouldn't we, and isn't it somewhat realistic for us to include in our comment back, not just we want more information, but we want the specific information. We want them to outline A, B, C instead of just give us more information. Will that be included, and shouldn't that be included in our comment?
Yeah, I think that is quite reasonable. So in the way that this would be transmitted kind of in writing, this is sort of a brief outline, and there would be, and kind of currently drafted, there are more specific requests associated with some of these same items, you know, that are mentioned there kind of in the middle bullet. But I think there's certainly room to be even more specific, you know, to have both broad requests and very specific ones. As was pointed out, I think the timeline for remediation in more detail is a great one. You know, so I think there's definitely room to request very specific pieces of information in the comments.
Because if we just ask, give us information, they may give us 2 sentences. They're not going to go overboard with, you know, killing themselves to give us more specifics unless we propose more specifics.
Right, and I think it's also true that, you know, PADP will respond to all these comments, but it could very well be that the response is, all this is to be determined in 2 years, and you'll hear about it then. So there's kind of nothing that can be done about that.
And if we're not satisfied with, so the public comment period, this is part of it, is going forward. They're going to have all their comments by January 31st. And then do they have a time frame by which they need to respond to the public comments?
I actually don't know that off the top of my head. Yeah.
I don't think there's a time frame. I have not seen it.
I mean, they will respond in writing, but exactly how long that will take, I don't know that I can say.
In your experience in the past, is it a 3-month, 6-month, year? Depends on the complexity of the project, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, more on the higher side of that rather than the shorter side would have been my guess, but.
Okay, all right.
I guess along the dovetailing in my earlier comments about the communication, that kind of ties in with this, what Rich is saying, as far as more details. Timing, completion, what steps, what are you doing? Are you completed?
Yeah, definitely need more communication from the DEP as we progress.
All right, if there were no
It
other
looks like we
questions.
have,
Oh,
it looks like
great.
we have a question. Go ahead, Sarah.
Sarah Caspar, formerly from EPA. Listening to this, from the first time I went to a meeting, it was clear to me, and it becomes more clear and even horribly clear. DEP doesn't know what to do. They have been dragging their feet, but you guys haven't sat down and said and demanded that they do something about it. So it's on you too. Kate has said over and over that this is cancer highway or whatever, and it's true, and these cancers still continue. The site has never been appropriately sampled, and I went over what had been done, and it was inadequate. If DEP couldn't handle it, and this is a complex site, they need to utilize or turn it over or get help from a group that can provide the help, because what you are all doing is you're sitting on a toxic site that is going to keep on giving its toxins until something is done about it. And to say that, well, DEP will. Number one, any questions you have, DEP has to answer them. They can't say, well, we'll answer that 12 years from now. They have to answer them now. You give them a time limit. You have the rights. This is your area. You're the ones that are experiencing the effects from the site. Tell them that if they can't do it, get somebody who can. This has been a site of interest back in the 80s, for God's sake. It's been operating since the 1950s. Do you think that there's only a little bit of stuff there? There's tons that's been accumulating over and over and over and over the years. And it's been just kind of, well, now let's see. It's time to stop now, let's see. You all need to get together and you need to say to DEP, you can't do it, get somebody who can, and do it now, not tomorrow. Because too many people have been harmed by the inactivity on DEP's site. No, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Donna, I'm going to interject 1 second here, and so we keep the flow of this presentation. Let's hold comments till the end of the presentation at this point. Thank you.
Got it. Thank you.
All right, so the fourth general topic was that PADP needs to make proactive efforts to ensure the safety of residents and clearly communicate how those efforts are going to be developed and executed. And we kind of touched on some of those aspects already. But to appropriately address the community's legitimate concerns about safety, PADP needs to let them know that they're going to provide oversight, and that means adequately communicating early on in the remedial process what's going to happen and what the community can expect. So some of the topics, and again, we touched on some of these already, that are safety related are, the need for ongoing monitoring and evaluation of off-site vapor intrusion issues. There has been TC detected in indoor air in residential and commercial properties, and although the risk associated with that TC has been determined to be acceptable, there needs to be ongoing monitoring to ensure that it remains that way. Risk assessment has not been performed for all the exposure pathways that may be associated, especially with residential site use, and that includes redevelopment, things like exposure to construction workers during trenching activities, which is one of those exposures that's actually difficult to screen out and probably requires monitoring during construction. Development of safety measures, and we talked about vapor capture during soil mixing, during remediation. What are those going to look like? How is PADP going to provide oversight, assuming that they are implemented by the responsible parties? And additionally, what are the institutional engineering controls going to look like, especially since, with respect to the institutional engineering controls and some of those other issues as well, they may not be implemented for some time. They may be implemented by the developer rather than the responsible parties that are, that this remedial effort that PADP is assessing is really supposed to be implemented by. So how will PADP coordinate remediation that may be carried out by two different parties to two different standards at two different times? Ensure that that's all protective. And these are all important issues that the township and the community has to have the ability to provide input on. And since they're not spelled out currently, it's really not possible to do so. Any questions on that?
Yeah, not specifically on that, but the continuing contamination of the groundwater, the source is the contaminated soil that's there, right?
To some extent, although that is an open question because there is source material in the bedrock as well. So the soil is maybe only the top 40 feet, and contamination goes down to 400 plus feet.
Right. Okay.
So yes and no, and the soil remediation is particularly important because it is the shallow groundwater impacts and the shallow soil that there is the most chance of exposure to, with respect to vapor intrusion, with respect to discharge to the Little Valley Creek, but it has not been determined what fraction of the overall contaminant mass that is.
Is this proposed remediation method the best chance of getting the contamination in the bedrock solved? Soil above the bedrock you can take away, right?
Sure.
Is this the best way
Well,
that science knows?
in some respects, it is better than excavation in that the effects of the in situ treatment will travel into the bedrock, so that the soil remediation will provide some remediation of groundwater. It's not clear how much remediation, and part of the remedial plan put forth by the responsible parties is essentially to do the soil remediation, and this is part of that FS addendum, see what happens with the groundwater, then, do top of bedrock essentially injections in these two source areas, see what happens in groundwater, then if necessary, do some bedrock injections and see what happens.
If this is chosen and if this is implemented, what is the typical, if it exists, time frame to determine from the time of injection to monitoring to determine some level of success? Is it months? Is it years? Is it decades?
Probably, and Tony should answer this question as well, but probably more like years than months, especially if it is proposed, if it's executed, I should say, in that phased fashion. This assessment has suggested that it's just a hypothetical outline that period of active injection, monitoring, and the active remediation for groundwater would span over a period of 7 years, and that after 7 years, they might be able to say, well, it's worked well enough, and now we can just switch over to natural attenuation. That's what they're suggesting may be the case.
So along that line, that's a good question, Rich. When does the proper, if this were supposedly successful, when does the property meet the standards to move forward? Is it the 7 years? Do you have to wait? Or just the completion of the remediation?
So, in some sense, meeting the standards, and again, it depends on which standards you're talking about, residential or non-residential to some extent, but meeting the standards, if we're talking about site-specific standards, is kind of decoupled from the remediation itself. You know, you can not do the remediation, cap the site, put in vapor mitigation, and say that you have, you know, and then prove that you have met site-specific residential standard. It's possible to do. You'd need a very robust vapor mitigation system. You would need more sampling, more institutional engineering controls, but it's technically possible. What the actual timeline would be, would probably be that, going again from the responsible party's point of view, they would not demonstrate attainment of whatever standard it is that they're attempting to demonstrate till the end of the active remediation process. Probably the development can't, proposed redevelopment could not occur until some aspects of the remediation were completed, just as a practical aspect of the type of work that would be involved. And certainly there's a requirement that the remediation be complete before development occurs.
Yeah, and that is one of the specific conditions that we've imposed. So there
Right.
will be
So,
no development until the remediation is complete and effective.
right, and that is, that kind of sets the timeline. If soil remediation may take 4 years and groundwater 7, you're obviously at least 4 years out before you could claim to meet, say, the soil standards. Statewide, at least. Again, site-specific, it can get you can get ahead of yourself there if you can eliminate pathways. But again, you need to be done with whatever active, the soil mixing part at least, would need to be completed before you could do anything. Did you have anything to add to that, Tony? This is kind of...
No, it really comes down to the active remediation, and what was detailed in the plan resolution as well, that, you would have to complete active remediation before you could do anything on the site.
Were there any other questions on this? All right, so the last and fifth broad comment is that there's a need for timely and rigorous oversight by PADP, and the township should not have the role of managing environmental risk. There is, based on the history of the site, a need for PADP to facilitate a timely remediation with active management, as opposed to kind of reactively responding kind of on a fixed time frame to things that are proposed by the remediating parties. The township would like PADP to clarify what the potential involvement of the township is in the remediation. Some aspects of remediation, like the pretty extensive array of stormwater best management practices that have been proposed as an integral part of the remediation, are things that the township traditionally has some responsibility for. And additionally, as we've covered, the township has volunteered essentially to get involved in some of the engineering controls to ensure public safety should residential development move forward, and that is not typically the township's role and something that PADB should be responsible for. That's the basic point of this, that because of the the timing and the multiple parties involved, that there has been a gap in management that PADB should be addressing. Questions on that?
A general statement here is that you've talked a lot about the remediation process, but I'm just wondering, is the process substantially different when we're looking at the 3 hot spots compared to the rest of the property? Maybe if you can comment on that, I appreciate it. Again, this is Scott Lambert.
Yeah, so the 3 hot spots that were identified previously for remediation were primarily associated with the higher concentrations of TCE in soils. So those are, significant sources for groundwater potential, or, they are sources to groundwater. Whether they're the most significant is maybe not entirely clear, but they are sources to groundwater, and they are, sources of potential direct exposure to TCE in the soils. So I guess some of the differences are that some of the other areas that have been additionally identified by PADP as potentially needing remediation are not TCE related. They may be related to hexavalent chromium or other contaminants that are present. And so the remediation techniques may differ for those other contaminants. That may mean different chemistry potentially of some of these in situ remedies, or similar chemistries can be applicable to both. Yeah, I mean, maybe elaborate on, that's part of the answer, but I'm not sure that I got to the whole gist of your question. If you want to elaborate on the
Just that I feel as though that what I'm hearing and what I'm understanding about the remediation process is broad-based, broad-brushed on the property, but to me, the areas that have identified with the worst TCE location, described as hotspots, I would think need a different type of remediation process or something more prolonged in order to clean that particular area up. And I've heard many people over the years that have been involved that site could be more of a potential catalyst to spread than maybe people may think about. So again, I'm just wondering how that hotspot really gets mitigated.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are definitely the highest concentrations of TCE in soils. They may still be treated in some of the same ways. They may just need a higher loading of whatever chemicals are applied in the in situ remedy. Very high concentrations, including residual DNAPL, can be treated with in situ remedies. It takes a lot more chemical. Tony, do you have anything to add to that?
Let's write a note here. Yeah, the hot spots, I mean, essentially, like when Nick said, it's a mass balance. So, the hot spots take more chemicals, whether it be in situ, chemox. It's just going to take more of it, a little bit longer of a time than the areas that are less contaminated. And actually, you'll see a greater reduction in the hot spots because it's easier to get to. As your concentrations decrease in those hot spots, it takes longer to clean them up, if that makes sense to you. Because it's a function of distribution, getting your chemicals, whatever you may inject, into that fight. So the less contaminated areas take a little bit longer because it's distribution. We got to get those chemicals into that fight. Hopefully that made a little sense there. It's a mass per mass.
I don't necessarily need a science lesson, but these chemicals that might be injected someday into this property, they have been time tested to have no other unintended adverse side effects? I hope.
Well, that's a good question, and we hinted upon that earlier today. Is you need to understand your chemistry and what you're trying to do, because there is a potential of creating other daughter products that could be more harmful. But we don't know that. They haven't disclosed that information yet.
Yeah, I mean, that would need to be addressed in some detail in the remedial design. So there's generation of daughter products. If you don't completely break down the TCE, for example, you can change. These are all the remedies that they of course haven't specified the chemistry, but probably where this is going to have to go and has been identified by both RU and GES is, some type of reductive chemistry, that causes changes in groundwater chemistry as well, which can change metal distributions, make some metals more mobile. You could wind up with a bunch of rust in Little Valley Creek if you didn't do it right. So there are certainly potential for adverse effects, even if the chemicals that are injected are not toxic. Iron filings or molasses are the two obvious examples. That's not to say that there cannot be adverse effects.
And as far as the state of affairs exists right now, the ultimate decision maker on what chemicals are going to go in there is going to be DEP, right? They
Correct.
have the staff, they have the expertise to review this kind of stuff?
Yes, and they have consultants that work for them as well. They certainly have experience with these things. This is a particularly technically challenging site. The very real potential of surface water impacts, the bedrock, all these issues are challenging. And obviously they will be working with something that is proposed by the responsible party group, which has their own experts working on it, and are motivated to do no harm. So.
Can I ask a question to follow up with what Rich said? Deb Mobile, you were assuming that DEP is going to make the decisions, but in this document, it doesn't really say that. Is it not whoever the responsible party hires? Don't they make the decision? So unless there's more oversight put into effect, unless the DEP is going to say, yes, we are committed to this amount of oversight, we don't really know what they're doing. Am I wrong there?
Well, I will say that, PADEP has ultimate control. The responsible parties will do some studies, come up with what they think is a reasonable plan, put it forward to DEP, and DEP has to approve or deny it. They can certainly ask them to go back and do more testing, do a tracer test to see if anything will get into the creek, do whatever it is that they may envision.
Okay. So they do have to seek approval before
there is a permitting process in order to inject these chemicals in, and it actually goes to the EPA level in Pennsylvania. You have to apply for injection permits in order to put those chemicals in the ground.
Okay, good. Thank you. That makes it much clearer.
One other thing for your pad and paper that Rich and I were talking about is that we'd like to make it very clear that we would like you, BSTI, to be an intricate part of the decision-making for oversight in what they're doing. Not on the back end, but more on the front end. For a number of reasons. So please, if you can add that as well.
Can I just add something really quick? I'm sorry, it's Donna. I have people that are raising their hands, and again, I'm just going to say that we're taking questions at the end of the presentation. I've written your names down just in case you need a refresher, but just so you know, I'm not ignoring you.
And it looks like we only have, what, one more page?
Yeah, no, there's
So-
just a wrap-up, essentially, and then we can take as many questions as
Open
there
it
are.
up, yeah, okay.
Thank you.
You know, so this is just to summarize kind of everything that we've talked about. You know, there's a real need for additional information on the specifics of the remediation before there can be really, truly meaningful comment on the remedy for the site. PADP needs to explicitly consider the residential use of the property during the remedial design. Pre-remedial investigations have to evaluate the potential presence of emerging contaminants like PFAS and fully delineate the impacts in soil and groundwater to the most stringent MSCs or other applicable standards. PADP needs to provide more information about how some of the technical and financial challenges, particularly the presence of residual DNAPL and deep bedrock, are going to be managed. They need to take on a holistic role in kind of ensuring public safety and more proactively communicating how the remediation will proceed. I know when the township expects that PADP will ensure a timely remediation at the site. You know, if that's 7 years, it's better than 40. So that's pretty much all I've got, and I'm happy to take questions.
This is Peter. I have a question. Since we're at the end here, in your experience on brownfield sites, I guess it'd be more of an opinion since we don't have all the facts. What is your opinion of the chances of this site being fully remediated? And I'll put that to Tony first, and appreciate Nicholas to follow.
Yeah, if you want to give it a first shot.
Well, when you say fully remediated, it's soil, groundwater, shallow groundwater, deep bedrock. Soil, shallow groundwater, quite possible.
Well, let's say hypothetically, since we don't know all the true contaminants.
Assuming that we know what we know.
Exactly.
Because there's a potential, like we said, there's potential emerging contaminants. PFAS has come up a couple of times that we don't know right now.
Absolutely.
And as you get deeper into the deep bedrock, fractured bedrock with the DNAPL, that's where it becomes increasingly difficult to fully clean it up.
It's very difficult to fully clean it up, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it is a complex site, this site.
To say the least.
Yes.
And you could probably answer it a little better if you had more facts, obviously.
Right. Anything else to add, Nick?
I guess I'll just kind of reiterate what Tony said in a slightly different way. I think there's a very real potential to remediate to the extent that it will eliminate immediate exposure pathways, you know, that this could be reasonably expected to be successful in, you know, reducing TC discharge to the stream in some reasonable time frame, whether that may still be 10, 20 years, you know, eliminating the shallow plume at least. But there's almost no possibility of fully remediating groundwater just defined as reaching statewide health standards, 400 feet down. And even if you tried, how successful that would be. Under the current plan, there's zero possibility because they're not proposing to do anything 400 feet down. Even if you tried, you probably still wouldn't reach those goals, although maybe you could speed things up a little bit. So it is challenging. I think you could make it safe, but I don't know that you can make it pristine, even if you were willing to spend the $100 million that it would cost.
Understood. Thank you.
This is not the first time a chemical injection approach could be ever used, correct?
Right. It's a well-accepted technique that's been used in many sites.
And not just Pennsylvania, but national?
Sure.
All right, okay.
No, I mean the general technical approach is sound. It's a question of the specifics, and how those specifics will apply to the geology of the site and what that will mean for remedial success in the different portions of the site.
In order to even start this process, that building's going to have to come down, right?
Yes, and
Period.
that's specifically
They can't.
specified in the assessment. You could try to remediate groundwater with injections around the building, but you couldn't do the soil remediation, which is supposed to come first anyway,
Right.
without completely demolishing the building.
Okay.
Are there any additional thoughts that you would like to add at this point in time, gentlemen, before we go to general questions? Steve, if you have anything? Okay. Yeah. Good job, by the way. This is
Thank you.
obviously complex, and we're kind of looking at things square peg in a round hole to some degree. We don't have all the facts, all the information, but thank you. So Donna, I guess we'll open up to the public for comments.
Sure. I'm going to actually call on Brian because Brian was one of the first ones to raise his hand. So Brian, if you can unmute yourself, that would be great, and identify yourself with the stenographer.
Brian Johnson, 72 Village Way. I've worked with this chemical TC, quite two different companies, Sunrock Corporation and also a company called Buchan Industries in Clifton Heights. Clifton Heights, the Buchan Industries, a company closed many, many years ago because of the toxicity of the chemical that you're talking about to degross steel. My first question, and really it's very serious, is are these tanks empty that was carrying this chemical that's in Bishop 2 right now, or is it still just leaking into the creek right now? That's my first question. Does anyone know?
I believe your question was related to the storage tanks.
Yes, the tanks that degrease the steel. Stainless steel,
Yeah.
and any type of steel, what they do is it goes through a cleaning process. And
Yeah,
that's
no,
where the TCE is in.
Yeah, and
Are
the
those
major
tanks
source
empty?
area was the vapor degreasing area. They used above ground storage tanks to hold the solvents, and I believe those tanks have been removed. They're certainly no longer TC present inside the building.
All right,
but-
you're saying you believe, but you don't really know for sure.
Tony, you've been in the
No,
building. I'm
I
pretty
mean-
sure there weren't any tanks there.
Yeah, I've been in the building before. I don't recall seeing any tanks, but that from the information we have reviewed from the record, we don't see any indication of any of those tanks there.
That's what I'm checking on right there for the one thing. And the other of my questions, I'll just leave to anyone else that wants to comment anymore because I really don't think there's anything you can really do, because you talk about injecting chemicals into the soil. You don't even really actually know exactly what these chemicals are that they're going to inject into the soil. You really don't know the validity as to how accurate and how well they will do what they're going to do to clean the soil. I don't believe there's anything there. I'm a mechanical engineer. I dealt with this stuff two different companies. There's nothing there. I don't know where you gentlemen come off talking about what you're saying when you have absolutely no idea. You need chemical engineers, fine. You need what you need. The process of what you're talking about is going to cost a lot of money. And what's happening right now is this site needs to be left alone. And I actually talked to Dustin Armstrong probably a good 3 or 4 years ago about this site. Him and I, we both said the same thing. It needs to be left alone. And not just for 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years. It needs to be left alone. And the only thing that you can do is basically clean it up to a certain degree to where maybe it can be used, as per Maya saying, as a, park or whatever type thing. That's it. And if anybody wants to go there, that's fine. I know I'm not going there. But anyway, that's enough I have to say.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Next up would be Kathleen. Can you unmute yourself, please?
It is actually
It's actually
Larry.
me, Larry Stauffer. I live in.
Oh, okay, Larry.
Sorry, I'm 64 Fonstock Road in Malvern. And to answer Brian's question, because I walk my dogs not on the site, but near the site, there is a building that's south of there that has, looks like there's still stuff in there. So I don't think they've completely investigated what's going on in that site. But the other observation that I have, which how ridiculous this all is if I, as a homeowner, contaminated the ground and it leaked into Little Valley Creek, I would be held responsible for that. So how is this company, this potential responsible party with deep pockets, able to get away with just letting this keep going on and on and on? If I contaminated the ground and my neighbors were influenced or affected by that contamination, I guarantee the township would be all over me to clean that up, to pay for it, and it would be on my pocket. I just can't understand how this has gotten this far. And I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional because, again, our daughter suffered tremendously from the effects of that site. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sarah, you're up again. Please unmute yourself. Can you unmute? Okay. There you go.
Here we go. Whoops,
You're good.
I am, okay. All right. What has been said is only hitting the surface. TCE, its chemical properties are unusual. And it is like if you have a radioactive substance, you know that in, let's say, 11 million years, half of the concentration of radioactivity will be reduced by half. And then in another 11 million years, another half will be reduced. That's the way trichloroethylene works. You will never get rid of it altogether. You will, if you use the right tools, you will reduce it. So this is my question. Why didn't this site stay with EPA, who does have the people to do the job? I don't think DEP does currently. I think what I have seen and heard of them, they have been very reduced in staff. But they've got to admit it and say, okay, we can't handle this, because all the time that they're not handling it, and what Mr. Stauffer was saying is correct. DEP had to go after these people and should have been getting them to do the job. They made one attempt, and because it didn't work, they said, kind of threw up their hands and said, oh, well. And meantime, the site continues to fester. So going back to what I was trying to lead, why did it leave EPA's hands? EPA had one of the best access to one of the best hydrogeologists who works in Exton, who wrote the Bible about this particular area and its properties, which is what makes it distinct from other areas. And no, it's been sitting in DEP's hands, and DEP has not taken charge of the site as it should have. So then that comes back to us. We need to demand that they do, and if they can't do it, bring in somebody who can. I think there was more that I was going to say, but this is what I have seen over and over and over again. And what continues to happen to the people who live here, to allow that to go on, it's wrong. There's no other way to look at it. It's wrong. So you have to say, okay, it's wrong, so let's see what we can do about it, and let's pull together as a group and be more forceful with DEP and see that you get something done, so that we don't have to have endless meetings asking questions that go unanswered. So I'm done. Thanks.
Donna, you're muted.
I know, I just realized it as I'm asking Carol Armstrong to unmute herself. Unmuted. Can you unmute? You're unmuted. Go ahead.
Thanks, Donna.
See? It's very hard here.
I know, but it all works. We're all living through it. Thank you very much. I'm Carol Armstrong. I live on Howell Road in Charlestown. I've lived in Chester County for 37 years, and I'm deeply committed to many things. I am a neuropsychologist who studies how people think, and also a cognitive neuroscientist who has mainly who has a special interest in environmental effects on the brain of various types, and have specialized in one of those types. I've also written a paper on the effects of solvents on the brain. So Bestie, I'm not an environmental engineer, so I can't really critique them, but they sound to me like they've done a very good job at educating you, trying to educate the Board of Supervisors on some of the critical issues, more broadly, I think, than you've heard perhaps before, focusing on the human aspects more. Rue has the DEP's consultant, environmental engineering consultant. They have a way of just changing the facts to give a result that they're interested in. So for example, they report on a number of chemicals at the site that are quite a bit above the defined PADEP exceedances of what's permitted, and then they'll conclude, however, that there's no risk to human health. They state that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service says that there's potential bog turtle habitat there, which is an endangered species, and then they say, but we don't think that there is bog turtle habitat here. So if there's something particular you're interested in, you go in and look in that document, you'll see. And that's the advisement that DEP is getting. I'm puzzled by the fact that you didn't get Bestie to educate you before you gave a conditional approval to the developer. If you had asked, Bestie could also have advised you on what the actual human health and environmental risks are from all of the chemicals. They would tell you that there are many solvents there. TCE is the worst, but there are many solvents there. And there are studies that show that low-level chronic exposure to TCE has impacts on brain function and other organs, cardio. Matter of fact, recent evidence shows that it's about 500 times that fetal heart's development is about 500 times more sensitive to TCE than was previously thought. They could tell you about the heavy metals there and how those heavy metals can dissolve in the water and move around. They can go into the air. They can move all over the place. So they could have, they've educated you well today, and they could have educated you more, but you didn't ask for that before you made a decision about the site. If you were concerned about the impacts of this site, you would probably be able, a lawyer could probably advise you on how you could defend your decision not to give that conditional approval, because I won't imagine what those arguments might be, but I'm sure that there are many of them. This site is very unusual, and I think some of your questions that I'm hearing today, the supervisors seem to be trying to get the thing down to size. How long is this going to take? Are there really chemicals that can do this? Are they acceptable chemicals? You're not asking questions that are really grappling with the seriousness of this site and the potential damage that can occur when you allow building there. This site is you hear the word complex, but you're not really thinking about what that means. It's complex because of the number of chemicals, the intensity of chemicals, the interaction of those chemicals, the heavy metals, atmospheric contamination isn't even discussed in the RU report. It's the length of time that it's been there, the fact that, people are telling you we've been damaged, the fact that there are studies that back up that this damage is not a matter of 7 years or whatever it's going to take to clean it up. As Dustin Armstrong says, there are going to be many opportunities for continued release of these contaminants, these hazardous chemicals, because they explain, PADEP explains that the groundwater will continue to send the TCE and everything else that's in there into Little Valley Creek, into the Schuylkill River. It's going to, and in the banks all along the way, where people spend a lot of time fishing and where wildlife depends. That's going to go on and on and on. People are going to be exposed to low levels of this going on into the future, and the people who are going to be most at risk are the people who are going to live at that site, because the ground's going to be dug again. Walls are going to crack. Some pumps are going to reveal vapors and contaminated water. It's complicated because it's so severe, so widespread, and so long-term. But your questions are helping you hide from these truths. Okay, you're not really taking the truth and grappling with it. And one, I want to ask, is Bestie going to be giving written comments by January 31st to the PADEP? Could someone answer that question? I have a couple more questions, but I'd like to know that one.
Yes, that is correct. We will be helping the township draft written comments for submission.
So you're doing it together, okay. Now, the law says that these decisions are based on the opinions of experts. But they don't have to take those opinions. And they have their own consultants who, as I've said, seem to be hiding their own data or making up conclusions based on the data. So I don't know that you can trust the DEP is going to be making decisions based on many of the issues that Bestie has talked about today. So I have two more questions. One is to the Board of Supervisors, why do you want houses to be built there? And my other question is, why do you not want houses to be built there? Why don't you say no houses should be built there? So two separate questions. I'd like you to answer them separately. The first one is, why do you want houses to be built there? And to please be as honest about it as possible, because we've never had any answers from you all as to why you're pushing this forward, the housing development.
Richard Orlo, I'll be happy to answer that very directly and very clearly. A prior Board of Supervisors changed the zoning on this property. After the zoning was changed, a land development plan was submitted by the owner. It is the owner, it's those two actions which led us to where we are now. Okay?
Yeah, but the decision.
That's why.
The owner can say, well, I will be harmed this many hundreds of thousands of dollars if you don't let me build there. This is my property and I will be harmed if you don't let me build there. But you have harm as well. You have harm in the people who live and are going to be damaged by living there and the people and around there.
And the prior Board of Supervisors that changed the zoning should have considered that. Once it's passed and once a plan is filed, the stage is set. That's Pennsylvania zoning law, and we're sorry that's the way it is. A member of the prior board resigned over being so upset about it, and that's where we are.
Well, I mean, I just really find it impossible to think that it always defaults to money. So my other question is, you didn't answer, why is it that you, I can't get it phrased right, why is it that you don't want no houses to be built there?
Rich, this is Steve Hahn. Can I interject here before you answer the question?
Absolutely.
May I ask
Yeah,
a
go ahead,
question?
Steve. Yeah, Steve
Yes,
is our counsel.
Yes, and good evening.
I'm sorry,
Here-
I didn't hear.
My name is Steve Hahn. I'm a solicitor for the township. And I hear your question. The purpose, and I hear your question, the board can certainly answer as it so desires, but the purpose of the meeting here tonight is not to address what has happened specifically with respect to decisions in the past. What we're trying to do is present draft comments to the public and to obtain feedback from you and other members of the public with respect to those draft comments, with respect to what DEP is planning to do with the property. There was, as Mr. Orlo explained, there were certain actions that happened in the past. The board did approve a resolution, which has been addressed tonight somewhat by BSTI. But again, I think the purpose of this meeting is really to gather comments from the community, gather comments from those interested, as we prepare, the township prepares its comments that will be submitted to DEP by January 31st.
Mr. Hahn, you
Yes.
can ignore me, but you cannot tell someone what question they can ask.
No.
And I will add that no one has ever answered that question, ever. The township has never explained, aside from the obvious legal, the fact
Yeah.
that the owner owns the land. And they've never really explained why there aren't all these issues that are actually more harmful are not being considered.
No one is ignoring you. No one is ignoring your questions. And I think Mr. Orlo answered your initial questions. No one's ignoring what you have to say. But again, the purpose of the meeting here tonight is to obtain comments in preparation of the township's comments, which you referenced earlier, that will be submitted to DEP by January 3rd. But again, no one is ignoring your comments.
Would you like to organize a meeting then where we can ask, why are you not stopping housing there? Anyway, I would, beside from your saying that that's not the purpose of this evening,
Yeah.
I would like to know from the supervisors, actually, why you don't want to stop housing there.
The short answer is the same answer as I answered before. Once the zoning is changed and once a person submits a land development plan, they have certain rights. And those rights are based on what's in a zoning ordinance and what's in a subdivision and land development ordinance. And once the two steps are taken, we have to follow what's in those ordinances under Pennsylvania law. That's the answer.
So I'll ask it as a hypothetical. Okay, hypothetically, if you were able to make a decision about whether development could occur in this complicated and toxic long-term site, would you want housing to be built there, hypothetically? I'm just asking for your human response to this. One human to another.
Carol, if we could go back in time, what we know now to that board, I suspect that decisions would have been different. There are laws that we have to follow on both sides. It's not so much as to whether we want something there or not. There are laws that we have to follow. Personally, be the last place on earth that I would want to live, but that's besides the point.
Thank you for answering.
Thank you. Next up is Stephen Schmidt.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Stephen Schmidt. I'm a resident in the village. First, I would just like to make a comment thanking the officials in the township for organizing this and giving us a chance to voice questions and opinions. I'd also like to thank the BSTI folks for their apparent diligence in reviewing the documents, and just my fellow neighbors, and of course the Delaware Riverkeeper for the tireless work in bringing this into the light. And all of us, I think it's pretty clear, would like to see this problem resolved favorably and in a environmentally friendly and healthy manner. So my questions go to the BSTI folks, and forgive me for asking the obvious to start off, but your review, I assume, included reading the RU reports and the GES reports, right?
Correct. The primary purpose of the review was to look at all those reports in the administrative record.
Okay. And in your review of the reports, and specifically in your review of the RU number 8 alternative amendment, which cites the 2 cleanup methods that you referenced, your opinion, is that an adequate enough cleanup to facilitate human occupation of that site?
So I guess there's 2 answers to that question. One being that remedial plan was very specifically not intended for residential use of the site. It was specifically aimed at non-residential use. So that plan was never intended to take it all the way to a residential use. That said, I think that the plan is reasonable approach to attempting to remediate shallow groundwater as well as soil. It is unlikely to reach statewide health standards for soil or groundwater, at least for some of the contaminants of concern that are present. Certainly it's not going to remove the inorganic contaminants that are present, although it may change them to less toxic forms, such as the hexavalent chromium becoming trivalent, or it may make some of the metals, other forms of metals, less available. So I don't, on its own, no, but I think with, and it's been said a million times, but with additional institutional engineering controls, I think it certainly is possible to make it safe for habitation.
But there would be more required beyond the scope of RA number 8, I think is what I'm hearing you say.
Correct. So there would, some of the possibilities would be that it could be required to cap some portions of the site. It is expected and required by the township as well that there would be vapor mitigation systems in any construction on site. And those are just a couple of examples. There would need to be, institutional controls to prevent other forms of exposure like digging, trenching through soils, make sure that there is not unacceptable exposure during construction. Those are just a couple examples anyway, but
Okay.
yes, more would be required.
And then my last comment and question, when you draft your recommended comments and share with the township officials when drafting the report or the response to DEPs during this comment period, will you suggest that the RU and GES reports and the suggestions made are insufficient in terms of satisfying a potential human occupation on that site? Will you put that in your report stating that as far as the material you've read and the suggestion that's on the table, it is insufficient as is to be deemed safe for human occupation?
I think in the sense that residential use needs to be explicitly addressed in the remedial plan, which it is currently not, you could say yes. I don't know that we will have the exact language you described, but in the sense that more is required to allow for residential use of the property, certainly. That'll be part of our
Okay.
comments.
And then finally, you read the RU report, you read the RU feasibility study report, June 17, 2019. If you look at section 1.2 on page 2, would you reference in your comments to DEP specifically the following sentence, which you'll find there, that says, as agreed with DEP, both this FS report and the 2019 RIR report assume that present and future use of the property will be non-residential only. Will you please include that in your comments to DEP?
Yeah, certainly, and I think that's part of the point we've been making, really almost the entire point that we were making with that initial first comment with respect to residential use, that were residential use included, we wouldn't be asking a lot of these questions. It would have been addressed in the course of the risk assessment that was performed, as well as the site assessments would have fully delineated the impacts at the site to residential standards for all COCs. So, yeah, I think it's a point very well taken.
Yeah, I can't overstate enough that the very material you've been asked to review is inadequate to determine and conclude that humans can live on that site. And I think that needs to be screened at DEP on paper, as well as the efforts of the community, the residents, and anybody else who cares about what goes on over there. So I just implore you to highlight that in your written comments. That's all. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Next up would be Mark Freed. You want to unmute yourself, please?
Thank you very much. My name is Mark. I'm an attorney with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and for the Delaware Riverkeeper. There were a number of comments made by the consultant regarding, I guess, the deficiencies.
I'm sorry, Mr. Freed, you're breaking up a little bit there. There were a number of comments made about what?
The deficiencies in the various reports and the information that is currently before DEP. Are you able to hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to highlight some of them because I think some of the points are significant. There is no, and Mr. Schmidt was addressing this as well, there was no residential use of the property was not explicitly addressed. There's obviously still lots of unaddressed contamination in the bedrock, lack of information on the chemicals to be used, and a general lack of specificity. I think there's a number of folks at this meeting who have experience with DEP and also EPA. We've seen many, many situations where comments get submitted. Comments are very nice. DEP will ultimately take those comments and create a decision and respond, and they'll say either why they did or in many cases why they did not accept the comments or incorporate them into their decision. So my question is, and this is particularly in light of the fact that this board has already approved the site for residential use, despite what I heard tonight is your consultant's admission that the site, there's no information indicating the site is appropriate for residential use. The ultimate question I have is, if DEP, and maybe when DEP, but I'll couch it in terms of if DEP does not accept many of your comments, say on the residential issue says that's not really our issue, that's an issue for the township, we're not going to address it, or they don't address the bedrock or don't provide more specificity on the chemicals to be used at this time, what action is the township going to take? It's nice to submit comments. Comments can be helpful, but at the end of the day, the question is when those comments have been read and acted upon or not acted upon, what is going to be the township's response if some of these bullet points, and even if I go to the first page of the PowerPoint, if some of the overall summary points are not addressed by DEP. So that's my question.
I think at this point in time, we'll address that when DEP comes back with what they come back and confer with our solicitors.
Yeah, Mark, this is Steve Hahn. And I hear your question, and I think that Mr. Lambert's correct that when we receive DEP's comments back, then we'll at that time appropriately discuss, consider how DEP responds to our comments and other comments.
And I appreciate that. I mean, the township is obviously, Steve, in your very capable hands. I just, and you and I have both seen too many instances where people spend a lot of time, put a lot of thought into comments, and you know, they go up on a shelf potentially. I'm sure they'll be read. I'm sure they'll be commented on, responded to. But the ultimate question is, and what I'll call the $64,000 question is, what happens when all the back and forth is over, and you're still looking at a site which, in this case, is over 15 years, and still the amount of unanswered questions. And again, this is me listening to your consultant tonight. The amount of unanswered questions, given the amount of time that has progressed on this site, to me is truly mind-boggling. That you can have this many question marks after this much time.
Yeah, and we can speculate on what DEP will do or DEP won't do. As you said, we both have been involved with a number of matters. And I think at this point, Mr. Lambert said that we'll see what DEP comes back with. And then certainly we will discuss how DEP responds at that time. But I hear your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that it? Okay. Is that it, Mark? I'm sorry. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sure. Okay, next up is Maya Van Rossum. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you so much. Maya Van Rossum, the Delaware Riverkeeper, leader of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and part of the Bishop Tube Clean and Green Coalition. So I'm afraid, Rich, I can't let you get away with your response to Carol of, well, the zoning changed, and so we had to say yes. That, just for the record, I'm not going to ask you a question, but that is truly unacceptable. And Scott, you mimicked that, and that is unacceptable. You had an opportunity to say no. We pointed out for you all of your own local authority and your constitutional opportunity to reject development of the Bishop Tube site, residential development of the site. And you chose to ignore the people and to ignore that opportunity and to, in fact, side with the developer to defend your decision to allow development of that site. So it is unacceptable that you try to foist it off on some people who were on a board previously. That is your responsibility. That was your choice. You allowed it to happen. You're going to make it happen. If that site gets developed and more people get sick, that is on you. And you need to accept that responsibility. I did not intend to come into this comment so upset and angry, but the fact that you would abdicate your responsibility and that you had that right and opportunity to say no, and we handed it to you on a silver platter. It is unacceptable that you do not accept responsibility for that. You, Rich, and you, Scott. Now, with regards to the comments that I was going to say, the STI, it's funny. This meeting, just like the other meeting, I began with such high hopes because you began from such a positive place, identifying so many problems. And by the end, you started to equivocate. And you started to side with DEP, and you started to go soft on your answers to questions and the information that you were spotting out, almost suggesting that what DEP had done, while there were lots of data gaps, while there were lots of problems, while they didn't meet the residential standard site use, which we know now will happen because the township has allowed it to happen, unless there are some other forces that intercede. By the end, you were seeming to say, well, yeah, that's kind of, yeah, they're doing it. Well, that sort of made sense. Well, yeah, there could do more, but that's not acceptable. You began by identifying all the problems, all the deficiencies, all the pitfalls, and then you went soft. Let us all remember, the only reason why we are here at this time evaluating a potential remediation option for this site is because the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and the Staffers brought a legal action against the Department of Environmental Protection and forced this issue in court. The case may still be ongoing, but that is why this is happening. And the fact that they would put forth such a deficient proposal simply to try to get themselves out from under that ongoing litigation, which is obviously what is happening, is disturbing at best. And if in any way, shape, or form, BSTI, you go soft, if in any way, shape, or form, Township, you go soft on DEP, that will be unacceptable, because that is all they're doing here. They put forth a whole bunch of paper and a whole bunch of words so they can go back to the court and say, see court, we did something. Don't find against us and our failure to enforce the law and our constitutional duties to protect the environmental rights of the people of East Whiteland Township and the entire community. Don't give them that opportunity. Don't give them that out. I began with such high hopes in this meeting, and by the end, you went soft and you equivocated, and that's disappointing. At the last meeting, you actually were pretty firm about the fact that the failure to address the groundwater in the bedrock was a significant concern. This time around, you started to suggest comments. You put forth language that was like, well, maybe, maybe not. That may or may not be a problem. We'll have to see. It'll take time. What happened between then and now? Who talked to you between then and now? How and why would you change such a fundamentally important aspect of this? The bedrock is going to be an ongoing source of contamination. You acknowledged that last time. The Delaware Riverkeeper Networks have acknowledged that on the record. Why are you not being firm on that now? You must be firm on that. Why are you suggesting that soil removal would not, in fact, provide the best level of protection? Whether or not there may be other issues with it, properly implemented, removing that contamination from the site, removing the source, taking it away, is going to be the best alternative to deal with the problems in the soils. Why on earth would you equivocate about that? Don't. The removal of the soils, addressing the contamination in the bedrock, these are fundamentally essential elements of remediation, and you must stand firm on those issues for and with the township. You had said that, I think it was somebody from BSTI said that the PRPs are motivated to do no harm. So that's why we should think that this is a great idea that they're putting forth with our friends at DEP, who only decided to take action because they were being challenged in court for their failure to fulfill their constitutional obligation to protect the rights of the people to clean water, clean air, and a healthy environment. The PRPs are not motivated by their concerns for the public and their wish to do no harm. They are motivated by the dollars and the cents and how quickly and easily can they get out from under their obligations under the law. Make no mistake about it. If they were concerned about the community, if they were concerned about harm being impacted or being inflicted on the environment, on the health and the safety of the community, on Liz Stauffer, on her friends, on Bill Conigan, who talked about himself and his children, on other residents, if they were concerned about doing no harm, they wouldn't now be in legal struggles with DEP over the costs. They would have acted years ago in their own right, not waiting until we, the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and the Staffers, forced DEP to force them to do what they're required to do under the law. Let us please not minimize what is going on here. Let's be true to what is going on here. DEP is trying to get out from under. The PRPs are trying to get out from under. And it's the people in the environment who are going to suffer if we go soft and we equivocate and we allow them all to get away with it. I am very concerned that in the, I heard, mention of chromium hexavalent. I heard mention mention of vinyl chloride. Well, in fact, according to our experts, one of the biggest concerns about the remediation of this site is the fact that there is so much, almost sole emphasis on TCE and not addressing these other contaminants, not addressing vinyl chloride in a really serious and significant way, because it is such a danger to the environment and to the health and safety of the people. So I would like to know from you how and when you are going to dig in on the failure of DEP to address these other contaminants. I'd like to know how you are going to dig in on the issue of needing to fully and meaningfully address the source contamination that will endure over time in the bedrock unless it is addressed. I would like to know why you are minimizing soil remediation or soil removal and remediation as a powerful and important solution here, regardless of whether somebody can point to other issues. We can point to other issues about everything, but that still is going to get rid of the source material, and that's the problem here. So I have more to say, and I would also like to know whether or not you have taken the time to review the expert reports submitted by the Delaware Riverkeeper Network last Friday. We worked hard to make sure that we got them in so that you would have an opportunity to review them. Have you reviewed them, and have they informed the proposal that you have put forth today? And I think that I'll leave my questions at that. But I'm sorry that I had to get upset. I intended to get on and just ask a series of questions, but I was so incensed by how you responded to the question about residential development and not accepting responsibility, and then so incensed by the seeming, in the beginning being strong, identifying all the problems, and in the end suggesting that DEP and the responsible parties actually are proposing to do what is right by the community, almost as if that we shouldn't worry about it, and we should worry about it. Thank goodness the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and the Staffers are still in court to hold them accountable. And rest assured, while we may not have been successful in the litigation against the residential development decision to date, if the township does not fulfill the obligations as laid out in that final determination, all the way to the end, you will find yourselves in court again with the Delaware Riverkeeper Network, and I will be sorely disappointed if you don't take the opportunity to side with us and do what is right, as opposed to siding with the developer and helping them get away with it.
I guess I'll briefly respond. I can certainly start with the easy question. We certainly have reviewed the comments you submitted and appreciate that they came in time for us to look at them and take them into account. And I would say that many of the technical aspects that you and your experts highlighted are quite similar to the things that we are planning to highlight in our comments. Some of the issues with bedrock, which I don't feel like we're minimizing at all. I think it is still a very significant issue which has not been yet appropriately addressed, and understanding what the implications are for the persistence of the plume and the ability to reach some of the remedial action objectives that have been stated for the site. So I don't think that there is any technical conflict necessarily there, although certainly there may be some differences in approach. I'll just say on the subject of soil excavation that there are minuses to excavation and off-site disposal, as well as positives, and specifically in the case that residential development were not to occur, there are a lot of environmental impacts associated with excavation and long-distance disposal of hazardous waste like that.
But just a reminder, at this point, residential development
Certainly
is going to happen, and that must be the context of your comment.
Right,
It is going to happen because the township approved it.
And the major difference is particularly with respect to the inorganic contaminants, which obviously are not going to be destroyed by any chemical treatment, although they may be less available. You know, that is a real issue that would need to be managed in any future development. So I'm certainly not minimizing that either, and I think that will be highlighted in the comments.
I'd like to address your one comment. Is you had your opinions and your position. We as the board had different legal opinions presented to it, the position about the development. And we concluded with our solicitors, this was the course of action that we had to take. Not necessarily personal decisions, but this is what was directed to us by our solicitors, recommended by our solicitors. And you've had many conversations with Joe McGrory pertaining to this, so you know exactly what I'm talking about.
I take advice from my attorneys and I tell them what position to take.
I understand. Donna, are there any other questions out there?
Yes, we have, excuse me, it's either Larry or Kathleen Stauffer are up next.
Well,
Okay.
It's both of us.
It's kind of both of us.
You just went on mute.
I'm live
There
now.
you go. You're not, yes.
I do want to state again that in our suit against East Whiteland Township in November 9th, I believe it was, that was glaring to me is that the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and me, who was a plaintiff, representing my community on one table. On the other table was East Whiteland's solicitor and the developer's solicitor. And for me right now, I'm hearing what my supervisors are saying. I hear that you were handed a baton that sucked. I understand that. But that was glaring to me, that my solicitor for East Whiteland Township was sitting with the solicitor for the developer, as opposed to sitting with me and my community in that courtroom. And for me right now, that is like so potent. It's just like, so where do you stand? And I know, and I understand Rich and Scott and Pete, Pete down the street, I get it, that it wasn't until Larry took you for a walk around Bishop Tube's site, not entering the site because that would be illegal, of course, but to see what you were dealing with there. And it wasn't until this community spoke up, and with the power of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and the power of our constitutional right, Article 1, Section 27, that says that we have a right to clean air, clean water, and a pristine environment. And we messed it up. And to hold the people accountable who messed it up for us.
So to reiterate what Carol Armstrong was questioning, and then what Maya asked to, and then Rich, you answered it saying that, you know, you were past this from a previous supervisor committee or whatever, supervisors. And again, what Kate said, if it weren't for us, the person that, I'm not naming any names, but the person that actually was part of the consideration of rezoning that had never visited the site. And when I took him down through the site, he goes, quote, wow, this was a mistake. So now you guys are saying, well, we're left with this, we have to approve it, but you're saying that that kind of overrides the health of people that potentially would be living on the site. I don't think health would, I think health should override, and I understand that you're going to be faced with legal action against the developer, but I think health is more important than the legal development potential lawsuits. I'm sorry. Again.
Well, cancer walks and money talks. Is that what it is?
And we've lived through it. I mean, what else do we need to say? That's it.
Okay, looks like we have one last comment here as far as I can see, and it looks like it's Carol Armstrong. Please unmute yourself.
Yes, it's Carol Armstrong, Howell Road, Charlestown. Just a couple of simply stated things. The metals on that property that are in the soil, in the groundwater, and in the surface water, according to RU and DEP, are arsenic. So think about each of these, please. Think about what you know about these things. Arsenic, chromium, hexavalent chromium, which is far more serious, lead, manganese, nickel, thallium, aluminum, and vanadium. All of those cross the fetal barrier. All of those cross the placenta into the fetus. There are 9 or 10 solvents there, and there, as you know, there may be PFAS and other contaminants. So it's very difficult to find any decisions that are easy to make anymore. And sometimes I think the best thing we can do is to just be aware of the cost and benefit of the decision we're making. That if I'm going to, be aware of the cost I'm paying for a decision that seems to be a benefit. And so for every decision that you make, I want you, so one other basic fact I wanted to say, streams only exist because they feed off of groundwater. Streams that are perennial. And, Pennsylvania has the longest miles of stream of any state, second only to Alaska. We are stream rich, and that's because we have a lot of groundwater that are constantly feeding our streams. So unless it rains, all of that water is coming from the ground. And so those hundreds of feet or however far down, those metals and solvents and TCE are, they're going to be always leaching into Little Valley Creek and going downstream, maybe for hundreds of years. And then we, of course, don't know really how extensive all the other soil and surface water and air releases are going to be. So as you think about the choices you make, please realize that the cost is that you're going to be spreading these contaminants far and wide for a very, very long time and putting future generations, future people's babies at risk at elevated risk, at elevated risk for not just cancers, but neurodegenerative diseases, developmental diseases, heart diseases, and other diseases as well. So just please, every time you make a decision, please remember that what you're paying is the extension of all of those hazardous substances far and wide for possibly hundreds of years into the future by allowing it to be disturbed so that houses can be built on it. Thank you. I'm finished.
Thank you.
Donna, we have one more public question from Deb Mobile here.
Okay. I was gonna say I don't see anybody, but yeah, okay.
Hopefully you can hear. I have been attending these meetings concerning Bishop 2 for almost 5 years now. And after reviewing the proposed DEP plan for cleanup, believe it or not, I was at a loss for words. The DEP has had 21 years to come up with a safe and efficient cleanup plan for the Bishop 2 property. Instead, they issued a report that is filled with more questions and gaps in data than answers. We were hoping to have these questions answered so that we can make an informed opinion to submit to the state before next week's deadline. Instead, we were told that our questions would be answered at the end, after the deadline had expired. This left me thinking, how can we formulate an educated opinion if we don't have answers to our questions? So I started making my list of questions, and I have lists and lists of questions, but I'm going to skip over those questions for now, because we've spent the last 2.5 hours highlighting those questions and highlighting the need for more information. I do want to quote a couple of phrases that our own experts, our own consultants here, used several times, which really stuck in my gut. We need a more detailed and full remedial plan. Need to inform the community. The public deserves clarity. Need to address community concerns. These are things that really hit with me, because this is why all of us have been fighting and arguing, and even though we have diverse opinions on the matter, I do believe that we're all concerned about what's going on here. But the public stands supreme. So you need to go back to the DEP and tell them they are not done at the drawing board. You need to tell them that we expect better. No, we deserve better. As citizens of the state of Pennsylvania, we are entitled to clean air, pure water, and the preservation of natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic values of the environment. Thank you.
With that, are there any other additional comments from the staff?
Oh,
At this time, we conclude our meeting. Thank you.